The day Elsie Crawford drove her wagon into Dalton Flats, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was alone, and she had the particular kind of jaw set that told a person she intended to stay that way. The town of Dalton Flats was not much to look at. It sat at the edge of a wide red plain where the grass came in sparse yellow patches, and the wind never quite stopped blowing. There was a general store run by a man named Hector Briggs, a saloon called the Red Spur that smelled of sawdust and whiskey even from outside, a livery stable, a small church whose white paint had given up against the sun years ago, and a scattering of houses that seemed to lean into one another for company against the open emptiness surrounding them. The territory beyond the town limits was the kind of country that made men cautious and made most women refuse to set foot in it at all. It was big and dry and indifferent, and it had a way of swallowing people whole. Elsie Crawford was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, green eyes that caught the light in a way that was almost unsettling, and hands that were already calloused from months of driving a wagon across country that had no interest in being crossed. She had come from Missouri. She had inherited 40 acres of land from her uncle Harlan Crawford, who had died the previous November without a wife or children to leave anything to. The 40 acres sat 7 miles northeast of Dalton Flats, backed against a shallow creek, and a stand of cottonwood trees that Harlan had always called his only real neighbors. She pulled the wagon up in front of Briggs's general store and wrapped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down with the ease of someone who had been doing it for weeks. The two men sitting on the bench outside the store watched her with open curiosity. One of them, an older man with a silver mustache, took his hat off. That was either respect or warning. She couldn't tell which. "Morning," she said. "Morning, ma'am," the silver-mustached man said. "You passing through?" "No," Elsie said. "I'm Elsie Crawford. I own the Crawford land northeast of town. Harlan Crawford was my uncle." The two men exchanged a look, the kind of look that carried a whole conversation inside it. "You're alone?" the younger of the two asked. "That's right, ma'am," the older one said carefully, turning the hat in his hands. "This is rough country out here. The Crawford place hasn't had anyone living on it since Harlan passed, and it's 7 miles from town on a road that isn't much of a road. There's been trouble with a group of men led by a fellow called Denton Ware, land disputes and the like. And the territory itself," he paused, searching for words that were honest but not entirely unkind. "It's no place for a woman alone." Elsie looked at him for a moment. The wind pushed a strand of hair across her face and she tucked it back. "I appreciate you telling me that," she said. "I'll need 50 pounds of flour, some salt pork, dried beans and coffee, and whatever nails Mr. Briggs has in stock." She walked into the store and left the two men sitting with their unsolicited advice still hanging in the warm morning air. Hector Briggs, to his credit, filled her order without comment, though he did ask twice whether she wanted him to send word to anyone on her behalf. She said no both times. She paid for her supplies in hard coin, loaded the wagon herself when he offered to help and she declined, and drove out of Dalton Flats toward the northeast with the red plain opening up before her like something that had been waiting. The Crawford land was exactly as Harlan's letter had described it, which was to say it was rough and lonely and full of potential that would require considerable work to realize. The cabin was small, one room, with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace that needed repointing, and a front door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. The well was good, which mattered most. The 40 acres were a mix of grassland and scrub, and the creek that ran along the eastern boundary was running clean and clear with spring melt. There were the cottonwood trees, just as Harlan had written, standing in a row along the water like tall, pale sentinels. Elsie spent the first 3 days cleaning the cabin from floor to rafter, repointing the fireplace mortar with a mix she made herself, and fixing the door so it hung properly. She planted a kitchen garden in the plot beside the cabin, working the hard-packed earth with a spade until her shoulders screamed. She checked the fence lines and found 2 stretches that needed replacing and marked them in her mind for later. She slept deeply and without apology. She did not miss company, exactly. She missed her mother, who had died 4 years earlier. She missed the sound of a familiar voice in the morning. But she did not miss being told what she could and could not do, and that particular silence, the silence of no one offering unwanted counsel, was a kind of peace she had not known she needed until she had it. On her 4th morning at the Crawford place, she heard a horse on the road and went to the window with her hand near the rifle she kept leaning against the wall. The rider who came into view was tall, riding a sorrel horse with a white blaze, and he was moving at an easy walk, not the kind of pace that suggested trouble. He wore a dark hat and a canvas coat despite the warming weather, and there was a star pinned to the front of the coat that caught the morning light. She went to the door and opened it. The rider stopped a respectable distance from the cabin and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Crawford," he said, "that's right. I'm Lewis Redmond, deputy sheriff out of Dalton Flats. Sheriff Amos Tate sent me out to—" He paused, seeming to choose his next words with some care. "To check on you." Elsie looked at him. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples and a jaw that was 2 days past needing a shave. His eyes were a particular shade of brown, that the morning light turned almost amber. He looked at her directly, which she appreciated, but he also looked slightly uncomfortable, which suggested he had a good enough sense of himself to recognize the awkwardness of his errand. "I'm fine," she said. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." A moment of quiet stretched between them. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the cottonwoods. "Was there something else?" Elsie asked. He shifted in the saddle. "I wanted to introduce myself is all. And to tell you, not because I think you need the telling, but because it's my job to say it, that if you have any trouble out here, you can send word to town and either Sheriff Tate or I will come out." "What kind of trouble?" He hesitated again, and she watched him decide to be honest. "There's a man named Denton Ware who's been claiming land in this area. He had his eye on the Crawford property while your uncle was alive, and now that it's in new hands," he glanced at the cabin and the garden and back at her, "he may come and make that interest known." "What's his claim?" "He doesn't have one that's recorded. He never filed anything legal. But he has money and men and a particular view of how the territory ought to be arranged, which doesn't always wait for legal arrangements." Elsie considered this. "Thank you for telling me, Deputy Redmond." "Lewis," he said, and seemed almost surprised by himself saying it. "If that's acceptable." "Lewis," she said. "I'm Elsie." He nodded, something settling in his expression. "I'll let you get on with your day." He turned the sorrel horse but paused before he rode. "For what it's worth," he said, looking back over his shoulder, "the old-timers used to say Harlan Crawford had the best kitchen garden in the territory. That plot of soil is good." He rode away before she could respond to that. She stood in the doorway watching the dust of him settle, and thought that he was, for a man sent to tell her what she already knew about her own situation, remarkably tolerable. The days that followed were filled with work so constant and physical that she fell into bed each night with the particular satisfaction of having spent herself completely. She replanted the fence lines, dug new post holes, strung wire with her own hands until the palms of them bore a constellation of small cuts. She repaired the roof where 2 shingles had cracked and water had been getting in. She brought the kitchen garden to life with careful attention and the good water from the well. She acquired 3 chickens from a woman in Dalton Flats named Mrs. Orella, who ran the boarding house and who pressed the chickens on Elsie along with a jar of honey, and the information that the honey was from bees she kept herself, and that Elsie was either very brave or very foolish, and that Mrs. Orella had decided she preferred not to know which. Elsie liked Mrs. Orella. She was a wide, practical woman with kind eyes and a directness that Elsie found refreshing. Lewis Redmond came again 2 weeks after his first visit. He did not present it as official business this time. He came in the late afternoon on a Wednesday, and he brought a piece of wood he said he had shaped into a wedge for her door frame, because he had noticed on his first visit that the frame was slightly warped, and the door would start sticking once the summer heat came. He showed her how to fit it without asking if she wanted the help, which was the correct instinct, and they stood together in the narrow doorway fitting the wedge until the door swung cleanly. "You're going to be out here a lot," she said, not accusingly. "I ride this circuit once a week," he said. "Harlan's place, your place, falls on the route. Does it?" "It does now," he said, and met her eyes briefly and looked away. She made coffee on the stove, and they sat at the small table inside the cabin, and she asked him about Denton Ware, because she believed in knowing her enemies as well as she possibly could. Lewis told her what he knew. Ware was from Texas originally, had come to the New Mexico territory 5 years ago with capital and ambition, and a disregard for the quieter people who had been there before him. He ran cattle and he wanted range, and he had a way of making people feel that selling their land to him was somehow inevitable. He had never done anything the law could strictly hang him for, which was the particular kind of man who was most dangerous, the kind who understood exactly how far the law could reach and stayed one careful step inside it. "Has he spoken to you?" Lewis asked. "Not yet," Elsie said, "but I've seen his riders on the north edge of my property twice this week. They don't come onto the land, they just sit their horses and look." Lewis's jaw tightened. "If they come onto the property, you let me know." "I'll handle it," she said. "I know you will," he said. "Let me know anyway." She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his coffee cup, turning it slightly in both hands, and there was something careful in the way he held himself, like a man who was very aware of the space he was taking up in someone else's house. "Why did you become a deputy?" she asked. He looked up, a little surprised by the question. "My father was a lawman in Colorado, marshal. He was a good man." He paused. "He died when I was 19, fever. I had been riding with him for 2 years by then, and I knew the work and I believed in it, so I kept doing it. I ended up in New Mexico territory 6 years ago and stayed." "You like it here?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't answer the way people answered when they weren't really listening to the question. "I like the land," he said. "It's hard and it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't." He paused again. "I like the people mostly. The ones who chose to be here rather than ended up here accidentally." "Which kind am I?" she asked. "The kind who chose," he said without hesitation. "That's clear." She felt something shift slightly inside her chest. Not the dramatic lurching of a sentimental novel. She had never had much patience for those, but something quieter and more genuine. A recognition, perhaps, of being seen accurately. He left before dark, the way a man with good intentions left a woman's property when he was that man in that time and that place. She watched him go and then went back inside to her work without making too much of it in her own mind. But she noticed that the following Wednesday she was aware of the direction of the road at about the time he usually appeared, and when the sorrel horse came into view, she did not pretend she hadn't been watching. He brought her mail that day, which he had picked up in town. There was a letter from her cousin in St. Louis and a notice from the Territorial Land Office confirming that the Crawford 40 acres was legally recorded in her name, Elsie Marie Crawford of Dalton Flats, New Mexico Territory. She read that notice twice and then folded it and put it on the shelf above the fireplace where she could see it. "It's mine," she said, which was not directed at Lewis particularly, but he was there and he heard it. "It is," he said. "People keep acting as though that ought to be surprising," she said. "Some people have small imaginations," he said. She looked at him. He was standing near the window looking at her kitchen garden, which was coming along well now in the late spring warmth, and the light was coming through the window glass at an angle that made everything look slightly gold. "Lewis," she said, "are you a man who says what he means?" He turned from the window. "I try to be." "Good," she said. "I prefer that." He smiled then, and it was a real one, the kind that reached the corners of his eyes, and Elsie Crawford, who had not been made unsteady by much in her adult life, found that she had to look back at her letter to recover herself. Denton Ware came in June. He came in the middle of a Tuesday morning when the sun was already vicious, and the air had that flat, dry quality that made sound carry for miles. He came with two men, both of them the kind of large and deliberately quiet that suggested they were there to remind her of something about herself. Ware himself was around 50, heavyset, with the expensive clothes of a man who wanted people to know he had money, and the eyes of a man who wanted people to know what that money could do. Elsie was mending the fence on the south side of the property when she saw them coming. She kept working until they were close enough to speak to, because she wasn't going to perform being frightened for anyone. "Miss Crawford," Ware said, pulling his horse up. "I've been meaning to get out here and introduce myself. Denton Ware. I run the Triple W Ranch about 12 miles east of here." "I know who you are," Elsie said. She kept the fence pliers in her hand. Ware's smile didn't waver. "Then you know I'm a reasonable man. I wanted to extend a neighborly offer. I've had my eye on this piece of land for some years, and I'd be willing to pay a fair price for it. More than fair, given the condition of the improvements and the market as it stands." "I'm not selling," Elsie said. "You haven't heard the number. The number doesn't matter." The smile stayed, but the warmth left it entirely. "Miss Crawford, I want to be straight with you. This is hard country. A woman alone, without men working the land, without the kind of resources needed to run a real operation, it's a difficult position to hold. Things happen out here that don't happen in more civilized parts." "Are you threatening me?" she asked. Her voice was completely level. "I'm offering you advice," he said, "as a neighbor." "I've had a good deal of advice since I arrived here," Elsie said. "None of it has changed my plans. The Crawford land belongs to me. It's recorded with the Territorial Land Office. I intend to work it and keep it. If you come onto my property again, I'll regard it as trespass and act accordingly." She looked from Ware to the two men with him. "Good morning, gentlemen." She turned back to the fence. There was a silence of several seconds in which she was acutely aware of the weight of the moment, and then she heard the horses turning and leaving, and she let out a breath she had been holding without realizing it and set her jaw and kept working. She told Lewis that Wednesday. She told it plainly, without dramatizing, because she wanted him to know what had happened, and she also wanted him to understand that she had handled it. He listened with that particular focused stillness he had, sitting at her table with his hat on the table beside him, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "He's going to try again," Lewis said. "I expect so. You should let me." He stopped himself. "What?" she said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was going to say you should let me help, but I know how that sounds." "It sounds like you think I need someone to manage this for me," she said. "No," he said. "It sounds like He stopped again and looked at the table and then looked at her directly, and there was something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen before. "I don't think you can't manage it, Elsie. I think you can manage almost anything you set your mind to, and I've known that since the first time I rode out here. I'm asking to help because I want to be useful to you. There's a difference." The cabin was quiet. Outside, one of the three chickens made a sound of mild complaint. "I know there's a difference," she said. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," he said. "You've been told your whole life that your competence is a condition you need to defend. It makes sense that you'd hold the line even when no one's trying to cross it." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a remarkably perceptive thing to say." "I have my moments," he said. She laughed, actually laughed, not the polite kind but the real kind, the kind that came up without her permission, and he smiled at it, the way a person smiled at something they wanted to hold on to. "All right," she said. "What kind of help are you offering?" "Let me talk to Sheriff Tate about keeping a closer eye on Ware's movements. There's a rancher named Abelino Vasquez about 15 miles south who's been having similar trouble with Ware for 2 years. If we can get testimony from him and from you, and from 2 others I know of, we can bring a pattern of intimidation to the Territorial Marshal's office." "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about Ware for a long time," he said. "You're not the first person he's pressed, but you may be the person who makes the case possible." He paused. "If you're willing." "When am I not willing?" she said. He laughed at that, and the cabin held the sound of both of them laughing at the same time, and neither of them said anything about it, but both of them felt it. Through June and into July, Lewis came out every Wednesday and sometimes on Saturdays as well, and neither of them made formal comment on the increased frequency, because to formally comment would have been to do something about it, and what they were doing was better than what either of them knew how to do formally. He helped her when she asked. He did not help her when she didn't ask. He understood the difference without being told, which was rare enough that she noticed it every time. She began to know his habits. He drank his coffee black and too hot, and he always burned his tongue on the first sip and never learned from it. He read. He had a battered copy of a Dickens novel and an almanac, and a geology survey of the territory that he treated as though it were literature. He had a dry sense of humor that he deployed quietly, almost to himself, so that she was often the only person close enough to catch it. He was good with horses in the way that some people were, with a patience and a softness of hand that the animals recognized immediately. She told him about Missouri, about growing up in the shadow of a father who had wanted sons and received daughters, and never entirely recovered from the disappointment. About her mother, who had been the kind of woman who carried her strength inside her where no one could argue with it. About her years after her mother's death, when she had worked as a seamstress in St. Louis because it was work that was available to women and she was good with her hands, and the way the years there had felt like living inside someone else's expectations, until Harlan's letter arrived, and the word inheritance had opened something in her she hadn't known was closed. "You weren't going to let anyone talk you out of coming," Lewis said. They were sitting on the porch in the long evening light, and the plain spread out before them in all that enormous redness, and the cottonwoods along the creek were dark against the sky. "No," she said, "I wasn't." "Were you frightened?" "Yes," she said, "on the journey some nights, but not of the land itself. The land doesn't care whether you're a woman or a man, it just requires effort." "No," he said, "it doesn't care, you're right about that." A coyote called somewhere far off, and the sound came across the flat land clear and mournful. "Lewis," she said. "Yes." "Why have you never married?" The question sat between them. He was quiet long enough that she thought she had overstepped, but then he said, "I was engaged once, 8 years ago. Her name was Margaret. She was from Denver. She came out to the territory to visit her brother, and we met, and she was wonderful, but she couldn't love the land. She tried for a year and she couldn't do it. The loneliness of it wore her down, and she went back to Denver, and she was right too. The territory requires a certain kind of person." He paused. "After that I didn't meet anyone who—" He stopped. "Who what?" Elsie said. He turned and looked at her, and in the evening light his face was open in a way it rarely was in daylight. "Who made the land feel like less of a compromise," he said. "Like it wasn't a price to be paid, but just where you were, where you wanted to be." Elsie held his gaze. The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a soft rushing sound, and the last light was going gold on the plain. "I understand that," she said quietly. "I know you do," he said. "That's the thing." She looked away first, and for a long moment they sat in the gathering dark without speaking, and what was between them was not uncomfortable silence but something else, something building and warm and patient. He rode home that night in the early dark, and she stood on the porch until she couldn't hear his horse anymore, and she went inside and sat at the table with her lamp, and acknowledged to herself, with the directness that was the most honest thing about her, that she was in serious danger of falling in love with Lewis Redmond, and that this was both terrifying and precisely what she wanted. The trouble with Denton Ware escalated in the middle of July. One morning Elsie found her south fence line cut in 3 places, and 8 of the long-horned steers she had purchased from Mr. Vasquez the month before were gone, driven off through the gaps in the night. The ground showed the marks of horses moving the cattle deliberately. She stood at the fence and looked at the evidence and felt something cold and steady settle in her chest. Not fear, fury. She saddled her mare, a sturdy gray she had named Agnes, and rode to Dalton Flats. She went to the sheriff's office and found Lewis there, and not Sheriff Tate, who was out riding the Western Circuit. She told him what she had found. She was calm about it. She was calm the way a woman was calm when she had learned that being anything other than calm in front of authority meant being dismissed as hysterical. Lewis was not calm. Not in a way that alarmed her. He didn't shout or slam things, but his face went very still and his voice went very quiet, which she had come to understand were his particular signals of anger. "Come with me," he said. They rode back to her property together, and he examined the fence cuts and the hoof prints, and he said nothing for a long time, only walked the line of evidence with the focused attention of a man reading something complicated. Then he said, "This was deliberate and organized. 3 cuts, the right spacing to move cattle without scattering them, someone who knew what they were doing. Where's men?" she said. "In all likelihood, but proving it is another matter." "How do I prove it?" He turned to look at her. "You don't. I do. Or we do." He said the "we" deliberately. She heard it, and she nodded. He rode to the W ranch that afternoon, and she went with him, over his initial objection and then his acceptance of her right to be there, because it was her cattle and her land, and she had made that point with the kind of quiet finality that he had learned not to argue with. They found Ware at his ranch house on the porch with 2 of his men in the yard, and Lewis was wearing his badge and the particular expression of a man who was carrying the law somewhere important. Ware received them with the genial smoothness of a man who had rehearsed this scene. He knew nothing about any cut fence, he said. He couldn't account for the movements of every rider in the territory. He was very sorry to hear Miss Crawford had lost cattle, truly he was, and if he heard anything, he would certainly let the deputy know. It was so expertly done that Elsie wanted to tip a bucket of creek water over him. Lewis held it together. He was courteous, and he was direct, and he made it clear in the careful language of the law that there was an investigation underway, and that the matter was not going to disappear. They rode away from the W with nothing conclusive, but Ware's smile had gone slightly tighter toward the end of the meeting, which Elsie interpreted as the small victory it was. "He's going to find out that we're building a case," she said as they rode back toward her property. The afternoon sun was brutal and the land shimmered in it. "Probably," Lewis said. "That might make him more careful or more reckless." "Men like Ware usually go more reckless," he said, "because their arrogance doesn't accommodate the idea that things might not go their way. What do we do in the meantime? We keep building the case. I'm meeting with Vasquez next week. There are 2 other homesteaders on Ware's list, and I've written to the territorial marshal's office." He glanced at her. "And you should, I know you don't want to hear this, you should not be entirely alone out here at night for a while. Do you have anyone who could stay with you?" "Mrs. Orella offered," Elsie said. "When I was in town this morning, I told her no." "Elsie." "I know," she said. "I'm going to think about it." He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between exasperation and admiration. "That's the most I'm likely to get from you, isn't it?" "It's exactly the most you're going to get." He exhaled, a short almost laugh. "All right." They arrived at the Crawford cabin, and he helped her water the horses at the trough, and the afternoon was quiet around them, the particular hot stillness of high summer in the territory. She looked at him across the back of her mare, the easy, competent way he moved, the way he managed to be present without crowding her, and she thought, "I'm not thinking about this clearly any more." "Lewis," she said. He looked up. "I'd like you to come to dinner on Sunday," she said. "Not as a deputy." Just as she stopped. "Just as Lewis," he said. "Yes," she said, "just as Lewis." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something in his expression open slowly, like a door in a room that had been closed for a long time. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." She nodded and looked down at the horse's neck and let the warmth in her chest be what it was. Sunday dinner was roasted prairie hen with herbs from the garden and cornbread, and a pot of beans she had started the night before, which was not a lavish meal by the standards of places that were not the New Mexico Territory in 1882, but which was as good as anything she had ever cooked, and she knew it. Lewis arrived with a small bunch of wildflowers from the plain, the purple kind that bloomed along the road in summer, which he held out with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and not entirely succeeding. She put them in a tin cup of water on the table, and they sat and ate and talked for 3 hours, which was the longest either of them had talked to another person about things that mattered in quite some time. They talked about what she planned to do with the land. She wanted cattle and a kitchen garden big enough to sell produce to the town, and eventually a small fruit orchard if she could find the right water management. He listened with real interest and offered thoughts about irrigation she hadn't considered, because he had seen it done on a ranch in Colorado, and it had worked well in similar conditions. He told her about growing up in Colorado with his father and 2 brothers, the particular brand of independent practical life that shaped a person in ways that made them either very capable or very difficult, and in his case had produced both. He told her about his older brother Caleb, who had gone to California and was now some kind of businessman there, and his younger brother Roy, who was still in Colorado raising horses. "Do you ever think about leaving the territory?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment before answering. "Less and less," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I have right now," he said, and held her gaze in the long evening light that came through the window and lay warm across the table between them. After dinner they sat on the porch again with coffee, and the night came down soft and enormous over the plain, and the stars came out the way stars came out in the territory, which was to say with the full force of what stars were, which in a city you could forget. "I want to tell you something," Lewis said. "All right," she said. "I have never met anyone like you," he said. "I mean that as accurately as I can say it. I don't mean it as a way of making a point. I mean it as a fact. You are the most—" He stopped and ran a hand through his hair in the gesture she had come to associate with him trying to say something he wasn't sure he could say correctly. "You are the most fully yourself person I have ever known. You're here on this land and you're completely where you're supposed to be, and being around you makes the territory feel the way I always thought it should feel. Not a compromise, just home." The night insects sang. The creek made its soft sound. The stars were extraordinary. Elsie set her coffee cup down carefully on the railing and turned to look at him. He was looking at the plain, his profile clear against the dark sky, and she could see the effort it had taken him to say what he'd said. "Lewis," she said. He turned. She leaned forward and kissed him, simply and directly, because she was a woman who said what she meant and did what she felt, and what she felt was that she had been wanting to do that for several weeks and could not think of a single good reason not to. He was still for a fraction of a second, and then he kissed her back, and it was gentle and warm and exactly right. And when they drew back she could see in his expression something she recognized as the same thing that was in her own chest, the particular relief and wonder of something falling into place after a long time of things being slightly misaligned. "I have been trying to be respectful of your independence," he said. "I know," she said. "I appreciate it. You can stop now." He laughed, and she laughed, and the night wrapped around the sound of it like it was something worth keeping. The case against Denton Ware moved forward through August. Lewis had gathered statements from Abelino Vasquez, whose situation was extensive and well documented. Ware's men had burned a fence line on Vasquez's eastern border and had twice run his horses off, which Vasquez had catalogued in his quiet, methodical way with dates and descriptions. There were 2 other homesteaders, a couple named Garrett and Fanny Sutter, who had been pressured into selling a parcel north of Dalton Flats the previous year, and who were willing to swear to the circumstances of that sale. Lewis packaged the evidence carefully and sent it to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. The marshal's response was not fast. Nothing involving Santa Fe was fast, but it was substantive. A marshal named Hargrove wrote back to say that Ware's name had appeared in previous complaints that had never risen to actionable levels, and that this consolidation of evidence was exactly the kind of thing that changed that, and that he would be sending a deputy marshal to Dalton Flats within the month to take formal depositions. Lewis brought the letter to Elsie on a Wednesday afternoon, and she read it at her table with the afternoon light coming in. And when she looked up, she was smiling the slow, real smile that she reserved for things that actually mattered. "Vasquez and the Sutters," she said. "They didn't have to come forward." "No," Lewis said. "They did it because it was right, and because you asked them." "I asked them because I knew they'd say yes," he said, "because they're that kind of people." She folded the letter and set it on the shelf beside the land office notice, and the two documents stood side by side like the foundation of something. "How do you think Ware is going to react when word gets to him that there's a marshal's inquiry?" she asked. "Badly," Lewis said, "which is why I want to talk to you about the next few weeks." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not going to tell you to leave," he said immediately. "I know better than that, but I want to be more present. I want to ride out here in the evenings as well as the days, and I want you to keep that rifle loaded and within reach." And he paused. "I want to tell you something else. I've been talking to Sheriff Tate, and there may be a position for a second deputy in the town, which would mean I'd be less on the road circuit and more based in Dalton Flats itself. It would mean I'd be closer." She looked at him. "Is that what you want, the position?" "It's yes. The position is something I'd want anyway," but he looked at her steadily. "You're a reason, too. I don't want to pretend otherwise." The afternoon was very still. Outside the window, a hawk turned slow circles in the blue sky. "Lewis," she said. "Yes." "What are you asking me?" He took a breath. He was a man who was precise with words when something mattered, and she could see him taking the time to be precise now. "I'm not asking you to need me," he said. "I know you don't. And I'm not asking you to change anything about the life you're building here because it's exactly the life it ought to be and I wouldn't touch it." He paused. "I'm asking if there's room in it for me. If you want there to be." Elsie Crawford sat with that question for a moment. Outside, the hawk banked and rose and became a small dark point against the enormous sky. The land stretched out in all its red and gold immensity, hers, truly hers, as she had known it would be from the first moment she had seen it. And beside the land this man, who had ridden out to tell her what she already knew and had ended up being something she had not expected at all. "Yes," she said. "There's room." Something in his face changed entirely. It was not dramatic, he was not a dramatic man, but it was complete, the way light changed when a cloud moved. "Good," he said. And then, after a moment, "Good." Denton Ware's response to the marshal's inquiry came not through legal channels, but through the practical expression of a man who was running out of time. In the second week of August, two of his riders came to Elsie's property in the late afternoon when Lewis was in town and rode across the south pasture in a way that was pure provocation, trampling the new grass she had seeded there and scattering her remaining cattle. They did not speak to her. They simply moved through her land as though it were already theirs and rode out through the gap they had made in her fence. She was standing at the door with the rifle in her hands when they rode out. She did not fire. They had not threatened her person, and she was not going to give Ware ammunition for a counter-complaint. But she noted the horses and the descriptions of both men with the precise attention she gave to everything important. And when Lewis rode out that evening, which he now did most evenings, she gave him the account in full. He listened with that stillness that meant anger. Then he said, "I'm riding to Ware's ranch tonight and serving him notice of a formal complaint for trespass. It'll go in the record. He'll deny it. Of course he will. But it goes in the record, and when Hargrove's deputy gets here it's one more piece." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm angry," she said, "but I'm all right. You can be both." "I know," she said. "I've been both for most of my adult life." He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the rifle barrel, not taking the rifle, just his hand over hers, and it was a small gesture, but it was exactly the right one. Not taking the weight from her, just being there alongside it. "I'll be back before midnight," he said. "Don't do anything that gives him a legal argument," she said. "I know my job," he said, which was not defensive but simply true, and he went. He was back before midnight, as promised. She had left the lamp burning and the coffee on, and he came in with the dust of the road on him and the particular tightness around his mouth that meant Ware had been precisely the kind of smooth, difficult that was infuriating in its legal untouchability. "How did he receive it?" she asked, pouring coffee. Like a man who knows exactly where the line is, Lewis said. He accepted the notice with that smile of his, and told me he had no knowledge of any trespass, and was very sorry to hear his cattle had strayed, and he would speak to his men about proper range management. He drank the coffee too hot and burned his tongue, and she watched him try not to show it. I told him that any further incidents on the Crawford property would result in immediate action. Good. He said I should give his regards to the lady. Elsie made a short sound. His regards. I told him you were capable of receiving them yourself if he wished to deliver them personally, but that he would want to be sure he was on the public road when he did. She looked at him. You said that? I did. She felt a warmth that was partly humor and partly something else entirely. Good, she said. He looked at her across the table, and he was still sitting in the chair in his dusty coat with the coffee and the night outside, but there was something so plainly and simply right about the scene that she thought, this is what it would be to have this, and felt the full weight of wanting it. Stay, she said. It came out before she had fully decided to say it. He met her eyes. A careful moment. The Briggs family has a spare room, she said, which was not quite what she had meant but was what she could say in 1882 in the New Mexico territory, where propriety was not an abstract concept but a practical one, even for a woman as independent as she was. Mrs. Briggs has told me she's happy to put you up when you're riding this circuit rather than having you ride all the way back to town after dark. I know, he said. She mentioned it. Will you, if you want me to? I do, she said. It would be easier, not just because of where, it would just be easier. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. He finished his coffee and rode the half-mile to the Briggs place to take the offered room, and she sat at her table with the lamp and the sound of the night outside, and felt the shape of things settling around her the way a good house settled on its foundation. The deputy marshal from Santa Fe arrived on a Thursday in late August. His name was Hargrove himself, which surprised Lewis. He had expected to send a deputy, not come himself. But it turned out that Ware's name had been in enough complaints from enough corners of the territory that the case had earned the marshal's personal attention. Hargrove was a lean, methodical man in his 40s with a manner that reminded Elsie of a good lawyer, precise and unhurried. He took formal depositions from Elsie, from Vasquez, from the Sutters, and from two of Ware's former employees who had been quietly located through Lewis's efforts, and who had more to say about the operations of the W Ranch than Ware would have wished. The depositions took 2 days and covered the cut fence, the stolen cattle, which had subsequently been found branded with the W mark on Ware's eastern range, the trespass, and the broader pattern of intimidation that Lewis's documentation made clear. Ware was formally charged on the 3rd day. Cattle theft and trespass were the primary charges, with the broader fraud case to be assembled in Santa Fe. He was allowed to remain on his property pending a hearing. He had lawyers arriving from Texas and money enough to make the legal machinery slow, but there was a federal officer's eye on everything he did now, and the particular kind of man he was understood exactly what that meant. When Marshal Hargrove shook Elsie's hand at the end of the process, he said, "You held your ground well, Miss Crawford." "It's my ground," she said. "That makes it considerably easier." Hargrove smiled, which was not something he appeared to do often. "I suppose it does," he said. Lewis walked her to her wagon after, and the late August afternoon was bright and clean with the smell of coming rain on the western wind. "It's not over," he said. "The hearing will take months. His lawyers will work hard." "But it's begun," she said, "and the cattle are coming back." Vasquez had confirmed the found cattle bore the Crawford earmark beneath the W brand, which was evidence that required no sophisticated interpretation. "The cattle are coming back," Lewis confirmed. She turned to him. They were standing in the street in front of the sheriff's office, and the town went about its business around them, and it was the most public they had ever been in any way, and she thought, "Well, Lewis," she said, "I want you to know something." "All right," he said. "Whatever happens with Ware and the hearing and all the rest of it, that's not why She stopped. started again. You rode out to my land to tell me it was no place for a woman alone, and I thought you were the 12th person to tell me that, and I was thoroughly done with hearing it. And then you turned out to be, she looked at him squarely. You turned out to be the only person who actually saw it the other way. He was quiet, looking at her with that amber-brown gaze that she had come to know so well. What I'm saying, she said, is that I love you. I want to say it plainly because I'm that kind of person and I don't want there to be any confusion about it. The street went on around them. A wagon passed. 2 women came out of Briggs's store. Somewhere at the end of the street, a dog barked at something. Lewis Redmond looked at Elsie Crawford in the middle of Dalton Flats on a Thursday afternoon in August of 1882 and said, with perfect quietness, "I love you too. I've been waiting to find a way to say it that was worth saying." She nodded once, which was her version of being moved. "That was worth saying," she told him. He took her hand, there on the street in front of the town, and held it with the easy certainty of a man who had made a decision and was entirely at peace with it. The fall of 1882 was the kind of fall the territory occasionally produced, as a kind of apology for its harshness, mild and golden, with just enough rain to green the grass and not enough to flood the creek, and the light in the evenings that made the red plain look like something painted by a person who loved it. Elsie brought in the kitchen garden and put up jars of preserved vegetables and dried herbs that she organized on the shelves, with the satisfaction of looking at work made permanent. She bought 4 more cattle from Vasquez to replace those she had lost, and added them to the 8 recovering from their wear-related detour. She repaired the last of the fence lines and winterized the cabin, adding a second layer of chinking to the walls and a new door seal that would keep the cold out when it came. Lewis took the second deputy position in Dalton Flats in October, which put him out of the road circuit entirely and gave him regular hours and a room above the sheriff's office, which was an improvement on various barn lofts and the like that had constituted his accommodations while circuit riding. The Briggs spare room remained available to him for the nights when the distance between town and Elsie's property made going back impractical, which was frequently. He continued to come on Wednesdays and Sundays with the regularity of weather. They fell into the easy rhythms of 2 people who had decided to be important to each other, and were discovering how well that decision wore in daily life. They argued sometimes. She was opinionated and direct, and he was not a man without views of his own, and they were equally stubborn in certain specific ways. But they argued well, cleanly, without cruelty or deflection, in the way of 2 people who trusted each other enough to disagree without fearing what the disagreement meant. She taught him how she did the kitchen garden, the specific crop rotation and water management she had developed across the summer. He taught her a method of tracking and reading weather from cloud formations that he had learned from a Navajo man named Frank Charlie, who had worked the same circuit for a decade before his death, and who had understood the sky over the territory in a way Lewis had tried to honor by remembering everything the man had shown him. She found that thinking about Frank Charlie and about Vasquez and about the Sutters and about the broader community of people building lives in the territory with no guarantee of anything gave her a feeling for the place that went beyond her own 40 acres, a sense of solidarity with the difficult, stubborn project of making a life in country that demanded everything and gave back exactly what you put in, no more and no less. In November, Denton Ware's legal situation moved toward its preliminary hearing in Santa Fe. His Texas lawyers were very good, and they managed to reduce the initial charges and introduce questions of procedural timing that delayed everything, but they could not make the evidence disappear, and the cattle with their overlaid brands were a fact that no procedural argument could erase. The Sutters' testimony about the coerced sale created a separate civil matter that Ware's lawyers were also going to have to manage. Lewis thought the whole process would take well into 1883, possibly longer, but he said it with the equanimity of a man who had learned to work within the pace of territorial justice. "He won't come at me again directly," Elsie said. "Not with a federal inquiry hanging over him." "No," Lewis said, "he won't." "Then we wait." "We wait," he said. She looked at him across the evening fire, the lamp burning low on the table and the night coming in cold and clear outside, and said, "Lewis, I want to ask you something that I want you to take seriously." "I take everything you say seriously," he said, which was true, and they both knew it. "Will you marry me?" she said. He was quiet. "I am asking you," she said, in case there was any uncertainty about that, directly. "I want to be your wife. I want you here, properly here, not at the Briggs place and not above the sheriff's office. I want the life we've been building to be the life we're building together in the same house, if that's what you want too." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she loved, the one that was doing several things at once, processing and feeling and thinking, and then he said, "I was planning to ask you. I have been planning to ask you for 2 months. I have a ring that was my mother's that I have been carrying around like an idiot for 6 weeks waiting for the right moment." She blinked. "You have a ring?" "I do, Lewis Redmond." "I know," he said, and he was smiling, the full open smile, not the careful one, and he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small cloth-wrapped piece which he unfolded to reveal a plain gold ring with a single small garnet that caught the firelight. "It was my mother's everyday ring, not the fancy one. She always said the everyday ring was the one that mattered because she wore it when she was actually living." Elsie looked at the ring and felt something in her chest that was too large for the quiet cabin and the ordinary evening. "Yes," she said, "I will absolutely marry you." He put the ring on her finger and she let him, and it fit as though it had always been there, which was the kind of coincidence she had never believed in before and found herself believing in completely right now. They were married in January of 1883 in the small church in Dalton Flats, the one whose white paint had given up against the sun. Mrs. Aurella made the cake, which was a considerable feat given the time of year. Abelino Vasquez and his wife Consuelo came. The Sutters came. Hector Briggs and his wife came. Sheriff Tate came and shook Lewis's hand and kissed Elsie on the cheek, and said that in his 30 years of law work, he had never seen a property dispute resolved as effectively as Miss Crawford had resolved hers, and that he reckoned the territory was better off for her particular approach to staying put. The minister was a young man named Ellison who had the thin, earnest quality of a man still growing into his own convictions, and he performed the ceremony with genuine care. And when he reached the part that said to speak now or forever hold your peace, there was a silence in the church that was the silence of a group of people with absolutely no objections whatsoever. They said their vows in the plain, direct language of two people who meant exactly what they were saying, and Lewis put his mother's ring back on Elsie's finger where it had been for 2 months already, and they walked out of the church into the cold, bright January morning as Elsie and Lewis Redmond, which felt so much like the natural conclusion of something that had been heading here all along that she had to stop on the church steps and just breathe it in. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "It's just right." He took her hand. "Yes," he said, "it is." They went home to the Crawford land, which was theirs now in the way that the best things were shared, not halved but doubled, each person bringing what they were entirely to the whole of it. Lewis moved his few possessions to the cabin that same day, which took very little time because a man who had spent 8 years circuit-riding did not accumulate much. A wooden chest with his books and his letters and some clothes. The geology survey, well worn at the spine. A good rifle and a handgun, and the maintenance kit for both. A photograph of his father in a marshal's coat, standing in front of a building in Colorado that was probably the courthouse in Pueblo, squinting into the sun with the expression of a man who was proud of something he wouldn't say directly. She made room for everything without rearranging what was already there, which was the household equivalent of everything she had ever said to him about how two people could occupy the same space without crowding each other. He hung the photograph of his father on the wall beside the fireplace where it could look out at the room, and she stood beside him looking at it and said, He has your jaw." "So I've been told," Lewis said. "He would have liked you very much." "I think I would have liked him," she said. Spring came and then summer and the Crawford Redmond ranch. She kept both names on the property, Crawford for the original stake and Redmond for what it was now grew in the deliberate, careful way she had always planned. The cattle herd expanded. The kitchen garden produced more than they needed, and she took the surplus to town and sold it to Mrs. Orella and to a new cafe that had opened on the main street. She started the fruit orchard, 3 apple trees and 2 peach trees planted along the south side of the cabin in the spots she had calculated got the best light and the most consistent water from the creek's seasonal overflow. Lewis continued as deputy in Dalton Flats, which gave him regular hours and brought him home in the evenings with the satisfaction of a man whose work aligned with what he believed in. He was well regarded in the town, the kind of lawman who was respected because he was consistent and fair, who treated the Mexican families and the Navajo people in the region with the same courtesy he extended to the Anglo homesteaders, which was not universal practice, and which he refused to apologize for. Denton Ware's case came to its final resolution in September of 1883. The cattle theft charges resulted in a substantial fine and the formal return of the cattle still in Ware's possession, though most had been dispersed. The coerced sale case brought by the Sutters resulted in a court judgment requiring Ware to pay damages. The broader fraud and intimidation case was still proceeding in Santa Fe, but the weight of the judgment was enough to damage Ware's financial position considerably, and by the end of that year, he sold the Triple W Ranch to a cattle company from Kansas City and left the territory entirely. He was gone before Christmas, and Elsie heard about his departure from Mrs. Orella with a quietness that was not triumph exactly, but was a form of satisfaction, the specific satisfaction of having been right about being able to hold something. "He's gone," she told Lewis that evening. "I heard," he said. "Good," she said, and meant it absolutely and moved on. Their first child was born in the spring of 1884, on an April morning when the plain was coming alive with the first green and the cottonwoods along the creek were budding. He was a boy, born with a lot of dark hair and the particular kind of purposeful expression that a newborn could carry, and they named him Harlan William Redmond, for Elsie's uncle and for Lewis's father whose middle name had been William. Mrs. Orella attended the birth and declared the boy perfect and substantial and entirely healthy, which he was. Lewis held his son in the first hour with the expression of a man who had not known until this moment the specific dimension of love that required both arms to hold, and Elsie watched him from the bed and felt the fullness of the life that had grown out of that first stubborn decision to stay. "Hello, Harlan," Lewis said, very quietly, to the sleeping infant. "I want you to know that your mother is the bravest person I have ever met, and the most competent." And the most, he looked up at Elsie and his eyes were bright. "And exactly the person she is," he said, "which is the whole of it." "You're very eloquent at 5 in the morning," Elsie said. "I have strong feelings," he said. She laughed, exhausted and deeply happy, and he came and sat on the edge of the bed with the baby between them, and the morning came through the window in long pale lines, and lit up the cabin and the shelf with its land office notice and her certificate of title and the photograph of Lewis's father. And outside the window the apple trees were putting out their first tentative white blossoms, small and certain against the spring. The years that followed had the texture of a life built properly, not glamorous in the way of novels or dime papers that romanticized the West into something it wasn't, but real and layered and incrementally better. Harlan was a serious, curious boy who followed his father around the ranch with a focus that his parents found alternately charming and exhausting, and who could identify cloud formations at the age of 3 that it had taken Lewis months to learn. He was a natural with horses in the way his father was, and Lewis taught him this skill with a patience that had no bottom to it. In 1886, Elsie and Lewis had a daughter. They named her Clara Ruth Redmond, and she was the precise opposite of her brother in temperament, loud, joyful, perpetually in motion, and in possession of the particular combination of her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn jaw that made her the most arresting person in any room she entered from approximately the first week of her life. Harlan received his sister with the protective gravity of a boy who took his responsibilities seriously, and their relationship had from the beginning that quality of a friendship that would last a lifetime, which Elsie and Lewis noticed and were quietly glad of. The ranch by 1887 was a real operation. 22 cattle, a working garden that supplied both the family and a steady contract with Mrs. Aurella's boarding house, and the fruit orchard producing its first serious crop of apples and peaches that Elsie sold in town and put up in preserves that had become the kind of thing people asked for specifically. She had added a second room to the cabin and a proper porch that went along the south side of the house, and the building had that looked-after quality of a place where someone intended to stay indefinitely. Lewis had been offered the sheriff's position when Amos Tate retired in 1886, and he had accepted it after talking it over with Elsie at length, because it was a significant change, and he wanted to be sure about it. He was a good sheriff in the way he had been a good deputy, firm and fair, and the town of Dalton Flats in the later 1880s had grown enough that the job was more complex than it had been, but he had grown into it, and it had grown into him. Vasquez and his wife remained their closest friends in the region. Sunday dinners rotated between the two properties, and the two families had the easy, comfortable closeness of people who had been through something real together and come out respecting one another. Consuelo Vasquez and Elsie had a friendship of their own that had nothing to do with their husbands. Practical, affectionate, full of the exchange of knowledge about the land and the growing things, and the raising of children in a territory that was simultaneously wonderful and demanding. One afternoon in the fall of 1887, Elsie stood at the edge of the south pasture where the new grass was coming in strong and thick, and looked across the Crawford Redmond ranch. The cabin with its porch and its 2 rooms and its smoke, the orchard along the south side, with the last of the apple leaves going golden, the creek with its cottonwoods that were bright as fire in the fall light, the cattle moving slow and peaceful in the north pasture. The fence lines clean and tight and entirely hers, and felt the whole weight and gift of the choice she had made 5 years ago when she had driven a wagon into this place alone, and refused every counsel that told her to leave. She heard Lewis behind her before she saw him, the sound of his step on the dry grass, and then his hand settled on her shoulders from behind, easy and warm. "What are you looking at?" he said. "Everything," she said. He stood beside her and looked at it with her, the land in its fall beauty, the long light of the afternoon lying gold on all of it. Harlan was in the near pasture doing something investigative with a stick and a patch of bare ground. Clara was sitting on the porch talking to the chickens, which was a habit that Elsie had decided not to discourage. "Are you happy?" Lewis asked. Not because he doubted it, but because he was the kind of man who asked, who wanted to know, who had never assumed. Elsie Crawford Redmond turned and looked at her husband, at the man who had ridden out to tell her she could not stay, and had then spent 5 years being glad that she had, who had learned her and loved her and built something real with her without asking her to be any smaller or any different or any less entirely herself. "Lewis," she said, "I have been happy before. I have had good days and good moments and things I was proud of. But this," she gestured at the land and the house and the children and the orchard and the cottonwoods and the sky and him standing there in his worn coat in the fall light. "This is a different thing than happiness. This is a life." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of years, and they stood together looking at the land that was theirs and the children who were theirs, and the evening that was coming in rich and gold over the territory. And the cottonwoods caught the last light and held it like something worth holding, and the creek ran clear and cold over its smooth stones, and the apple trees bore the evidence of a harvest just completed. And somewhere to the north, a coyote began to sing its ancient lonesome song into the enormous sky, and the land received it the way it received everything without judgment, with the absolute democratic generosity of a place that asked only effort in return for everything it had to give. Harlan looked up from his investigation of the dirt and called something to Clara, and she came off the porch in her usual headlong way, and they converged on something interesting near the fence. And Lewis watched his children with the quiet, deep pleasure of a man who understood what he had, and Elsie watched Lewis with the same quality of understanding. And the evening came down warm, and the lamp was waiting to be lit inside the house, and supper was waiting to be made. And tomorrow was a work day with its particular demands, and the day after that, and the day after that, each one of them necessary and full. She had been told the territory was no place for a woman alone. She had stayed alone anyway, with her fence pliers and her rifle and her kitchen garden and her 40 acres of red earth stubbornness. And she had been right too, because it turned out the territory was exactly the place for Elsie Crawford, and it had not been her aloneness that ended but her solitude that expanded to include the one person who understood that those were different things. Lewis pressed a kiss to her temple, and she closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in the smell of fall and his coat and the dust of the land, and everything that she had built and everything that had been given and everything that had been fought for, and one was here, all of it here, as solid and real and enduring as the land itself. "Come inside," she said, "before the cold comes." "In a minute," he said. "In a minute," she agreed. And they stood there in the last of the light, the two of them together on the edge of the land that had always been hers, and was now also his and would one day be Harlan's and Clara's, and whatever came after them. And the stars came out one by one in the enormous New Mexico sky, the way they always did in the territory, which was to say without ceremony, without asking permission, simply appearing in their full tremendous number, until the darkness above the plain was as full of light as the day had been. And there was no better way to end a day than to stand inside all that, and know you were exactly where you were supposed to be.